just going to put my phone on silent before I get started too.
All right. So yeah, I will turn it over to you, Kirsty, and yeah, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Jess, for that introduction and for inviting me to speak today. I'm excited to present to you today on the 2 chapters of my master's thesis, which I just defended last summer. As Jess mentioned, I've now moved on from that, and I'm studying waterfowl and wetland birds in Atlantic Canada, which is very different from what I was doing for my master's. So it's kind of fun for me to virtually travel back to the tropical dry forests of Costa Rica and to talk about this special place with you today. This is actually my thesis defense presentation, but because it's Friday afternoon, the end of the week, I trimmed down some of the denser stuff and added some fun video clips and things like that. I will mention for anyone that wasn't here earlier, there are some sounds and video clips in here, and hopefully they won't be too loud, or some of them I'll try to warn you before, but just be aware of it. It can be a bit jarring if you're not expecting it. Oops. Here we go. What you're looking at on your screen is a photo taken from within one of the last remaining patches of mature tropical dry forest. I wanted to show you this picture because these forests are a really important part of my master's research, and I'll return to them again and again throughout the talk. But because my research focused on bird sounds, I wanted you to not just see these forests, but also to hear them. So hopefully you can hear that. And so for my master's, I asked, what can we learn from listening to the birds? And I traveled to the tropical dry forests of Costa Rica to answer that question. And so what is a tropical dry forest? As you can see in this photo, they look very much like other tropical forests. They're very lush, very green, lots of deciduous trees. But what makes a tropical dry forest unique is that they only look like this for half of the year. And then for the other half of the year, they look like this. So they face extreme drought. And as you can imagine, the plants and animals that live here are specially adapted to deal with these extreme seasons. And in fact, wildlife of tropical dry forests actually exhibit unique behaviors, life histories, and even genetics that make them different from individuals of the very same species that live in nearby cloud forests and rainforests. And so I put in a slide to show you some of the really cool species that live in tropical dry forests. I won't talk about all of them, but I want to point out a couple. This one here is a Baird's tapir. It's an endangered species. And in this photo, this is taken at the height of the dry season. It's cooling off in one of the last remaining pools of standing water, probably for many kilometers. So kind of a gross pool of water, but it's hot and dry. So another species I want to point out is the neotropical yellow toad. So all those little yellow dots behind, those are all toads. Another really cool species that the lab I was doing my research with, they work on this species as well. They burrow underground during the dry season. And then when the rains come, it's kind of amazing. It's very abrupt from dry season to wet season. The sky kind of just opens and you get torrential downpours. And so I think what happens is the toads sense that and they emerge from their burrows and they head for where the water is starting to pool. And I actually have a video to show you from that because it's really quite amazing. This one could be loud. It's certainly very loud when you're there in person. So I'll just play that now. So those are all toads. It's like hundreds, if not thousands of toads. It's really quite incredible. And I don't think I mentioned this already, but they actually are usually brown, but they turn yellow just for this event, and they head to the ponds and or puddles at this point, and then the females will come meet them there. Usually, they don't even make it to the pond before they get bombarded by male toads. So I know I'm supposed to be talking about birds and bird sound, but I wanted to bring this example up because I think it's a cool example of a species of wildlife that's really specially adapted to tropical dry forests. Oops. Unfortunately, however, tropical dry forests are one of Earth's most endangered tropical ecosystems. And in 1986, Dan Jansen, a prominent dry forest ecologist, highlighted this conservation concern in his statement. In Pacific Mesoamerica, less than 0.1% of the original tropical dry forest has conservation status, and there are no remaining large areas of even relatively pristine dry forest. And so this is what inspired Dan Jansen and other dedicated biologists, the international community, the local people and Costa Rican government to embark on one of the most ambitious restoration projects in history. And this occurred right here in northwestern Costa Rica. And the result was the Guanacaste Conservation Area. So this is a very large protected area. As I mentioned, it's in northwestern Costa Rica, close to the Nicaragua border. If you ever get a chance to go down there, some of you actually may have been there before, but if you travel to Costa Rica, it's a really cool place to check out. So the goal of this protected area was to not only protect some of the last remaining small patches of mature dry forest, which was that picture I showed you at the very beginning, but also regrow the forests around these patches and reconnect them. And so now that you know a little bit about tropical dry forests, the wildlife that live there, and where I was working in particular, I will go into my research. So the first chapter of my research was on bird communities and their recovery in tropical dry forests. And so my research question was, how does habitat change influence communities of birds in regenerating tropical dry forests? So because parcels of land were added to this conservation area at different times over the past half a century or so, if you were to go there today, you'd see that it represents a mosaic of forests that are at different stages of the regrowth process. So some are just fields with just a little bit of regrowth. Others are regenerating forests of different ages. And still others are those original forests that were never cleared. And so my hypotheses were that different bird communities use forests at different stages of regeneration, and that they use them differently by season, so dry season and wet season. And we predicted that as forest maturity increases, that bird diversity and abundance would also increase. We also predicted that the community composition would also change, and that we would see different groups of birds using these different age forests. And so this chapter of my research was split into two main parts, and I'll talk about the first one now, which involves comparing communities along a chronosequence. We use a chronosequence when we don't have data from forests across many decades. So instead, we use forest sites of different ages that represent the different stages of regeneration. So for example, we would sample a forest or do bird surveys in a forest that's 10 years old, 20 years old, 30 years old, and so on, instead of going and doing a survey in the same forest when it's 10 years old, 20 years old, and 30 years old, which is pretty much impossible, or at least difficult. We did 150 surveys at 62 sites in both those regenerating forests of different ages, so these dots represent different age forests, and also those mature original forests that I showed you at the beginning. You can ignore this orange box for now, it'll come up later in my talk. We did bird surveys at least once in the dry season and then again in the wet season at the same site. So if it's not obvious, this photo was taken at the same site. This is probably late April and this might be early June. So you can see how quickly things change. We used automated recorders, and I actually went as a tree that year for Halloween with my very own automated recorder, just made out of cardboard. So very nerdy, but I guess I was really into bioacoustics. Anyways, so this is a spectrogram. It's a visual representation of sound. So when I was back in the lab, I took probably hundreds or thousands of hours of audio data and I downloaded them. Obviously, I didn't have time to go through all of that. So I chose to manually process just 10-minute samples of dawn audio for each survey to get a measure of species richness and abundance for each site. And so each species has its own sound signature, and I've highlighted a few to show you. So those repeated notes are an elegant trogon. This downward trill is a straight-headed wood creeper. And these little squiggles are long-tailed manakins. And actually this is two species singing over top of each other. You can see they're almost lining up, but not quite. And actually, if you're wondering why would two long-tailed manakins sing on top of each other, I've put in another video to show you why. This one shouldn't be as loud, but so there are two male mannequins doing their little dance and an inconspicuous female there as well watching. It's pretty cool. It's kind of rare to stumble upon this and see these guys. I had to be quite far back and I used my camera from a distance, zoomed in all the way, so it's a bit shaky, but the males will do this little dance and draw in the female, and if she's impressed, she will leave with the alpha male to mate, and the apprentice will have to go on and find his own apprentice and teach the dance. So kind of neat. Anyways, back to my research. So we found that bird abundance, richness, and diversity were higher in the dry season rather than the wet season. As you can see here, the box plots overlap quite a bit, so not a huge difference, but the results of our statistical tests did suggest that the dry season was slightly higher. Then we looked at the relationship between abundance, richness, and diversity with forest age. I've just put up abundance here, but the pattern was similar between all three. And as you can see, as forest age increases, abundance, richness, and diversity are also increasing. The orange dots here are the dry season surveys, and the blue ones are the wet season surveys. And these ones represent surveys in those mature forests. So these are just the regenerating forests. We also looked at community composition. So here you still have forest age at the bottom, but to understand community composition, I first took the bird surveys from all of the mature forests and created a representative mature community. And then I compared each of the bird surveys in the regenerating forests and compared them to the mature community to get percent similarity to mature community. So what we found was that as these forests grow back, the bird communities are becoming more similar to those in those mature tropical dry forests. So really encouraging result. And this is actually the infographic we published with the article when it was published. So to summarize this part of my research, diversity and abundance are increasing with forest recovery, and communities are becoming more similar to those in mature forests. Season influences detections of birds. So I say detections here. It is possible that season is influencing movements of birds. Um, but it could also be that they're just singing less in the wet season. A lot of birds are ramping up for the breeding season at the end of the dry season, so they might just be more vocal then. It's also possible, if you remember a few slides ago, those pictures from a site where there was very little leaves in the dry season and a lot of leaves in the wet season, that leafing out of all the trees could be influencing the way sound moves through the forest. So we can't say for sure how season is influencing the birds or why, but I think it's important that we notice this, and more research is probably needed there. So I mentioned before that we use a chronosequence when we don't have data collected in the same forest over several decades. But when I was researching for this project, I actually came across a paper where someone had done bird surveys in a particular forest in our study area 23 years before. And so I thought, how cool would it be to do point count surveys in the same forest 23 years later? So I did that for community comparison across decades. So in 1996, 30 point count surveys were done in this forest, which was 40 to 60 years old at the time. And in 2019, we resampled the same 30 points in the same forest, which was now 60 to 80 years old. And I told you to ignore that orange box. That's where we did these point count surveys. So in 1996, 267 individuals of 37 species were detected. And in 2019, we had 238 individuals of 35 species. Fairly limited change in species richness or abundance in 23 years, so not a big difference there. But when we look at community composition, we do start to see some changes. So here we've organized them into their respective foraging guilds, and we see that frugivores and insectivores slightly increased, and omnivores actually had a fairly large decrease. Not huge changes, but it is what we would expect to see. Frugivores and insectivores are often associated with older forests, and omnivores are associated with younger forests or more open habitats. That was number of individuals, but we also saw the same pattern with number of species as well. So to summarize this part of the talk, species richness and abundance showed limited change, but community composition does seem to be changing with time. In 1996, 12 unique species were observed that were not observed in 2019. And in 2019, we had 14 species that were not observed in 1996. This could partly just be differences in detections, but I want to highlight two interesting examples. One is the white-throated magpie jay, which is this fancy-looking jay up in the corner. This is an omnivore species, and it's a generalist. It was observed 11 times in 1996 and 0 in 2019. And in 2019, we had 8 great curassows and 0 were observed in 1996. And I think this one's really exciting because this is a frugivore species, it's highly forest dependent, and it was listed by IUCN as vulnerable. So I think it's really neat that we're seeing these birds starting to use those older regenerating forests. So to sum it up, what does this all mean? Going back to the differences we observed in seasons, I think it highlights the importance of considering season when you're doing research in somewhere like tropical dry forest that has these really extreme seasons. And it appears that restoration efforts are benefiting bird communities, especially birds like the great curassow that I just mentioned, that's now able to expand its habitats into these regenerating forests. And this research was published last year in Avian Conservation and Ecology. So if you're interested, feel free to check that out. Okay, I'm going to switch gears now from bird communities to a single species of wren that lives and breeds in those mature tropical dry forest fragments that I showed you at the beginning. So it's the same picture from the very beginning. This is the lovely Rufous white wren. For a tropical bird, it's not as visually exciting as some of the other tropical birds. But what's cool about the Rufous white wrens is that they have some really cool vocal behaviors. One of them is female song. Female song was historically ignored, but more recently there's been more research on it, and we're finding that it is way more widespread than we previously thought, especially in the tropics. They also duet, so the females and males can respond to each other's songs. To clip here, could be a little bit loud. Here we go. So that's pretty cool. That's the male and the female singing together. You can hear it's actually quite a low frequency song. So what was neat was in the field, we would actually be able to whistle that song and the birds would respond. So it's kind of fun. And as I alluded to just before, they defend year-round territories in those mature tropical dry forest fragments. So Rufous white wrens are not a species of conservation concern, but their habitat is. And for this research, I was able to use 17 years of monitoring and recording data from the Guanacaste Conservation Area. So really big long-term data set. I was able to listen to the original recordings from up to 17 years ago. So pretty cool. Okay, last video clip. I just wanted to show you this video because I think it's kind of neat. This is a Rufous white wren working on a nest. It's almost done. It is kind of a globular or flask-shaped nest. And it's in the wet season, you can see the drips on the trees. And they often build nests in acacias. You can see this tree has, it's quite spiky, and yeah, it looks pretty deadly. But what actually makes it more deadly, I guess, is it has a symbiotic relationship with these ants. And the ants are provided with sugars by the tree. And then in turn, the ants, I guess, provide the tree with security. So they'll, if you brush up against one of these trees, they'll attack you and their bites are awful. The wrens don't seem to mind them, that or the ants don't mind the wrens, I'm not sure which. But actually more importantly is they remove vines. They don't allow vines to attach to the tree. And you can see this tree right beside is already covered in vines. So anyways, I just thought I'd show you that because it's kind of neat. And you can see there's another Rufous white wren with nesting material in an acacia tree. So our research question was, how does the number of neighbors influence vocal behavior in female and male wrens? So the number of neighbors they share a fragment with. So I took this screenshot of some tropical dry forest. This is at the height of a very dry season. So these patches stand out in a sea of leafless vegetation. And I highlighted them just to emphasize the patchy nature. Just for reference, this is roughly about here. So those purple dots represent mature forest surveys. A pair of wrens may exist alone in a fragment with no neighbors, or they may have any number of neighbors up to probably, I think 4 was the most we had. Our hypothesis was that the number of neighbors influences vocal behavior in female and male wrens. And we looked at 4 different behaviors. So independent song rate. This is the number of solo songs that they sing in a particular time. Duet responsiveness. So how often do they respond to their mate to form a duet? Repertory use. These birds can sing quite a few different song types. So I think a male on average has 15 different songs. So how big is the repertoire they're using? And song type switching. So because they can sing several different songs, how often are they switching between them? We also looked at time of day and time of year, which was studied previously by another student, but they only looked at just a few years of data. So we wanted to look at this again with 17 years and just see if it matched up. So again, using bioacoustic methods, these are those same automated recorders, but we also used focal recording. So we were following around the wrens and recording them. We actually had mostly a negative result. We had, yeah, we didn't really find an effective neighbors on most of those behaviors, but we found one interesting result, which was that female wrens switch song types more with more neighbors. And we didn't find this with the male wrens, which is interesting. So this shows a few of the song types that they sing. So females were singing different song types and switching between them more often with more neighbors. We did also find differences, an effect of time of day and time of year, and differences between how males and females respond to these. I won't talk about all of these, but I'll just talk about one briefly. As time of year increases, so as the season progresses, males sing more, but females sing less. And for females, this makes sense because they're usually starting to nest and lay eggs, so they're not as vocal. To summarize, duetting and male singing were not affected by number of neighbors, but female song type switching rates was affected by more neighbors. And importantly, males and females respond differently to neighbors, but also time of day and time of year. So what does this all mean? It seems that in our species, at least, that males ignore their neighbors, but females are switching song types more, suggesting that they're not ignoring their neighbors. So why would they do this? Song type switching has been shown to be an aggressive signal, so they might be using it as a form of territory defense. Excuse me. And I think the big takeaway here is that both sexes respond differently to external factors, whether it's neighbors or time of day or time of season. And I really want to emphasize that there is an importance of studying female song. And even to take this one step further and say that we should, and when we're studying any animal behavior, we should be looking at the sexes separately and not necessarily just assuming that that females will respond the same way as males. If we had done this same study with only male birds, we would have completely missed this effect or this one positive result that we got. So it just shows the importance of studying female song. Yeah, and we didn't have a huge effect size with the results we got, but I think it's a good start, and I think more research is needed, perhaps with some experimental studies or something looking at this question. So, oh, and I should mention this this paper was just accepted for publication on Monday, so that's kind of cool, with the Journal of Ornithology. So to tie my two chapters together and finish up my talk today, long-term monitoring is necessary to understand how wildlife respond to change, whether those changes are forest fragmentation, number of neighbors, or population density, seasonal changes, or large-scale conservation and restoration efforts. And I think that our research suggests that these efforts are working. And I want to finish by highlighting that these efforts are especially important in places like tropical dry forests with their amazing, uniquely adapted wildlife. And it's through long-term monitoring of both behaviors, but also communities, and through large-scale conservation efforts that we can ensure the persistence of these wildlife in tropical dry forests. So with that, I just want to acknowledge all the people that were involved in this research, particularly the staff at the Guanacaste Conservation Area. And I added this quote by one of our research collaborators, and she says, "My experience is that cooperation produces as many breakthroughs and advancements as does competition." And I really like that quote because we had a really positive collaboration with them. So I agree. And I'm just going to leave it on this slide, which summarizes what I talked about. And I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Kiirsti. That was great. I don't know if you're able to see the chat, but folks usually type in questions
Okay.
there. But if you, yeah, if you
I'll
want to,
actually stop sharing my screen then. Yeah, okay. Now I can see the chat.
yeah. So it might take a little while. People, if they have questions, it might take a second or two.
No worries.
But yeah, it's funny. I forgot when you said at the beginning here that the bird world was so small. I totally forgot that Alana Demko. I met her,
That's
like
right.
10 years
Yeah,
ago, doing Canada Warbler work. When I was still an undergrad. But yeah, it's funny that I saw her
that's
name.
hilarious. Yeah, and I see that Mariah's on the call. We volunteered together at Wild Research out West. I think that's funny. Oh, there is a chat question. Oh, they want a recording of the presentation. And you did record it, so.
Yeah, we are currently recording this. So I will put a link to the YouTube, the WildEcol YouTube page. This will be uploaded hopefully in the next 24 hours or so, maybe 48 since it's a weekend. But it'll be there publicly accessible for you to watch. I'll get the link and post in the chat before we depart from here.
Okay, so someone asked, with the Wren study, do you know why females might be aggressive to one another? Is it to hold the best territories or is it to monopolize the best partners? That's a good question. It's probably both. And they definitely have joint territory defense, the males and females of this species. Um, but yeah, it could also be like mate guarding or something like that. Um, yeah, we don't actually know, and I think doing experimental work with this species and this question would help tease apart some of that. Um, yeah, good question. Friday afternoon, I guess people are just done, which is fine. I actually want to say hi to Karen Weeb. I don't know if she knows that I know her, but her cousin Lynette Weeb has been friends with my mom for many, many decades. So
Hi,
it's funny.
Kirsty.
I don't know if
My
you knew
cousin
that,
Lynette.
but
Hey, that's crazy.
I think she was one of the first people to see me when I was born. So
It's a small world. That's
it is a super small world. It's quite amazing. So I don't know. I thought I'd let you know that because I thought it was fun.
enjoyed your talk. I had a similar question to Ryan, actually, like why the females would be more aggressive sort of to neighbors than males. It's an interesting flip of what you would predict between the sexes, but
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think it just emphasizes the need for more research into female song. So hopefully that happens. Um, yeah, I think we had a whole bunch of other ideas as to why it could be. Female intersexual competition is more recent. Hmm. Yeah, yeah. If I had more time to devote to the study system, I would pursue it more. But now I've moved on to a completely different field of research. But yeah, and actually, I mentioned that this is a 17-year data set, and now last year and this year they won't be going back. So we've got a big hole in the data set now. So hopefully someone goes back there and studies these wrens again, but we'll see. Um, yeah, so someone asked, was the reason for the greater number of species in the dry season due to migrants, or were you focused solely on residents in both seasons? Um, we actually didn't have too many migrants, like long distance migrants. And not a lot of migrants will go through uh, the tropical, like that part of Costa Rica during migration, because the timing of the height of the dry season is kind of around the same time when migratory birds are moving through. And if you're a migratory bird, you don't really want to be stopping in this like wasteland. um, so most will stick to the cloud forest and rainforest. So there are local migrations with the resident species. There are species that will move from the rainforest and cloud forests to the dry forest. I thought it'd be higher in the wet season because there'd be more resources. But I read later that some species of trees actually flower right before the wet season. So there could be something there. It could also be the other reasons I mentioned, so hard to say, but really good question.
I was curious about the point counts that were spanned between like 96 and recent, more recently, and you didn't see a huge
Mhm.
influx of species on the point counts. But I'm just curious. I'm not super well versed with Costa Rican bird species in the tropical dry forest, but as far as addressing like with point counts, like missing these more cryptic tropical species that maybe are moving in, that I'm thinking of like in South America, like ant pittas, some other species that are much more cryptic and less detectable that maybe are moving in to that regenerating 80-year-old forest, and you're just not picking them up in point counts, but they're there.
Yeah, and there are definitely species that don't like royal flycatchers. I don't know if anyone's seen those, but they're the ones that you see sometimes. They have the amazing crown. They barely vocalize at all, and they're a mature forest species. So, I mean, they could have been there and we didn't pick them up. But I think the important point about the point count surveys is that the ones 23 years ago would have missed some of those more cryptic species as well, and we would have missed them as well. So it's only really biasing the results if the species in younger forests are more vocal than species that use mature forests or something like that. And I don't think that's the case. And really, it was more of just a kind of a fun side project as opposed like we weren't able to use any uh, we weren't able to do any statistical analyses with those data. We just kind of presented them as is, like as observational data. But I thought it was still interesting to look into. Someone asked, how difficult was it for you to learn the different species in both the birds and trees since there are so many? And do I have any good resources for tree ID down there? So I actually didn't have to learn the trees because our collaborators had all the vegetation data, and so I was lucky. I don't think I could have learned all the birds and all the trees in that short of a time. But the birds was quite a challenge because it was probably at least 200 species that I had to learn. So I just did a lot of practicing with, with like Xenocanto and things like that in our lab's sound library. As far as good resources for tree ID, there is a really good book. Um, it's a bit older and I can't remember what it's called. I could probably find it and maybe post it in the, what is your group? The WildEcol Facebook page. If I can get the name, I'll send it there because it's a really good resource for, I think it's trees of Costa Rica and Panama or something.
All right, I guess we can see if there are any last questions that folks kind of want to ask Kirsty before we begin to wrap this up
No
for the
worries.
weekend.
I'll look up that tree book, see if I can find it.
And I guess in the meantime, for the folks who are interested in what's coming up, in 2 weeks on the 5th of March, we have a speaker who will be discussing the evolution of mating signals in willow flycatchers. So sticking with the avian theme into March, hopefully it'll be a bit warmer when that happens as spring begins to creep in.
Yeah, I'm ready for spring. Oh, okay. Yeah. I thought that was a pretty good book for trees of Costa Rica and Panama. There was another one too, but that one seemed to be pretty good.
Okay, so I guess if no one else has any more questions for Kirsty, we will wrap this up. And thank you for sharing that very interesting talk with us on this Friday afternoon. And
No
yeah, I
problem.
don't
Thank
know.
you, Jeff, for host or for inviting me. Sorry, I cut you off.
Yeah, yeah. So I would say you're welcome to come back and talk about your current work now with ducks, but I'm not sure. Hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll be doing these in person whenever things resume normally. But who knows? Maybe we'll take a hybrid approach and do a little bit of both. But yeah.
For sure.
All right, folks. Thanks for coming and enjoying Kirsty's talk. Yeah, and just if you're interested in the next talk, it's in 2 weeks. We'll have that link sent around on Facebook and the other social media platforms. So yeah, keep an eye out for that and enjoy the weekend. Yeah, have a great weekend, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for listening.